Welcome to Crime Scenes and Cultures. I'm your host, Tony Kale, along with my co-host and cohort, Mr. Kent Holloway. Kent, how are you doing this evening?
Doing fantastic, Tony. I appreciate it. You inviting me here to be part of this.
Absolutely. Well, we want to take a look at the various cultures around the world that, in many cases, show up during forensic procedures, during investigations. My friend Kent here is a forensic death investigator and quite familiar with this kind of work. And my background is in cultural anthropology. And so together, we want to look at some cases and incidents throughout the years, forensic encounters where perhaps someone, maybe they're a victim or someone who is able to assist with information about a particular crime scene is involved in a specific culture that maybe we're unfamiliar with. Kent, over the years in your work, can you say you've seen elements of unfamiliar cultures show up during investigations?
Well, quite a few. I live in Northeast Florida. I work in Northeast Florida, St. Augustine, the nation's oldest city. So we may not have as much of some of these cultures that you're talking about here as we would in Miami or someplace like that. But I've been doing this for 27 years, and I have seen evidence throughout my investigations of anything from Santeria to witchcraft to Alomayambe. It's essentially been a little bit of everything, and here and there, it's sprinkled in. And the homes that I go into, I've seen artifacts, I've seen, salt in doorways, all kinds of things that without proper context would be a little maybe spooky for a lot of people. And so, yeah.
And I think you hit on something imperative there when you said, a residence. When we encounter humans in our communities, we have sacred spaces. Our homes are sacred spaces. And to take it even further, spiritual traditions have sacred spaces. So we are guests in the homes that we enter, and that's dealing with the living and dealing with the dead. And so I think that's one of the reasons this is very important. You spoke of encountering some of the different religious traditions. I've worked over the last several years with different agencies providing consultation in regards to identifying cultural aspects at scenes. And it seems like the biggest question that people have isn't this some sort of criminal activity or does this mean these people who practice this unfamiliar practice are evil? The biggest question is, what am I looking at? And, in some cases, this leads to, if you don't know exactly what you're looking at, it can create scenarios where if you're dealing with the family of the deceased, that there may be confusion, there may be lack of communication because perhaps someone in the family is scared to communicate what exactly it is you're looking at. Have you had encounters such as that?
Yeah, and I have, and I kind of liken it to dealing with a foreign language in many ways.
Hmm.
A lot of times, a lot of the scenes I go to, a family, we have a very large Russian population just south of St. Augustine, and a lot of the Russians don't speak English very well, and so law enforcement goes in, they're asking questions, and there is this communication block. And the same is true when we're dealing with these maybe strange artifacts that, you walk into a house and you see instantly the guardians, the Orisha guardians of Santeria, and instantly communication is shut off right then and there with law enforcement. They see that, they freak out, they step out of their house, and they think, uh, there's a problem here. They instantly go to something along the lines of suspicious, even though the death may be completely natural. But because these things are there, there's a communication gap that they can't breach because they don't know enough to approach it. And so there becomes problems in their investigation from the moment they step in the house.
Yeah, historically, we know that in interacting with cultures that we may not be familiar with, we do unfortunately, have situations where bias may enter the picture in interacting practitioners or a particular culture someone may be unfamiliar with. I think back several years ago, there was an incident in the Midwest where there was a fire in a residence, and when the local fire department responded to the call, one of the first responders at the scene went into the building, and the first thing he spotted was statues and candles and assorted coins and different things that really just sort of looked malevolent to this person. And when he came out, he told his fellow responders, hey, there's some sort of voodoo going on in there. And so the whole incident sort of freaked out the responders. They felt like they were entering something they should be scared of. And in reality, the scene turned out to be a very traditional sacred space created for the Afro Caribbean religion of Santeria. There was nothing malevolent there, just simply an unfamiliar sight for someone outside of the religious community. And, throughout the years, as we're discussing this here on Crime Scenes and Cultures, we've seen a lot of misunderstanding about specific cultures that are encountered in the field. Have you seen some examples of this in your area as well?
Well, yeah, I have actually. There's one particular death investigation that it wasn't a case that I worked. It was one of the investigators I work with, and she went into this home of this lady, and once again, you had the altar at the front, the entrance of the house. You had all these odd statues that did look malevolent. They did look strange. And as she went through the house, she began to see more and more signs of it was actually Santeria. And of course, law enforcement and this particular investigator never really seen this before, never dealt with this, didn't know what they were dealing with. Yeah, it became a major issue with them as they proceeded to investigate this thing. They actually had to call me to sort of help them figure out what was going on here. But it definitely became an issue.
We've seen throughout the years many different spiritual traditions that have been misunderstood and a lot of times mischaracterized and feared. There was a lot of false information that came out during the 80s when there were concerns over Satanism and belief systems that a lot of people were in fear of. And I think during this time, we saw the characterization of a lot of what we consider esoteric belief systems sort of thrown in the same hat. And all of a sudden that if you've got, a sociopath who's using the aesthetics of, what is said to be Satanism and committing some sort of criminal activity, then you also, should throw in practitioners of other esoteric belief systems, which is erroneous and is not fair to characterize those cultures like that. It's interesting. I'm currently developing a book on some of the Afro-Caribbean religions. And it's interesting to look at historically when religions like Santeria arrived in Miami, that there was this mass panic over this new religion here in the U.S. There were stories that came out in the newspapers and on television about, these perceived voodoo rituals and this fear of criminality. And, it sort of gave all these different cultures sort of a skewed image when this first came out.
Yeah, I remember, in the 80s, I remember that, this was the time where Dungeons and Dragons was being attacked for, leading into witchcraft and Satanism. And a lot of the music was also equally as attacked. And so there was this heightened sense of fear and heightened sense of misunderstanding for these religions. I remember, of course, being a child of the 80s, it was the greatest decade of television in the
Absolutely.
history of television, in my opinion. But I think every single TV action adventure show that was ever produced, from The Incredible Hulk with Bill Bixby to, Chips to whatever, each and every TV series that existed during this time had episodes where voodoo was depicted, and
Mm.
voodoo was always depicted in this very evil light. The bad guy was the voodoo priest. The bad guy was performing these rituals. The bad guy had the voodoo doll and would hurt the hero and that kind of thing. And so it's easy to see how a lot of people growing up in this period, especially, might have some misunderstanding as to how these religions actually work.
And it's interesting you bring that up about the portrayal of voodoo in the academic realm. There is a shift in utilizing the term voodoo and vodun. And vodun is typically being used to denote the African traditional religions that are has historically been called voodoo, but with voodoo being related to the Hollywood stereotypes. And it's interesting to look back. We can look back as far back as like the 1930s and 40s, and there's these images in entertainment industry of these horrible images of anything African traditional religion based. And we've found ads for movies and minstrel shows where anything African at the time was considered evil. And so this sort of just continually rolled through the years to create this horrible stereotype we see of this tradition that millions of people hold as sacred, which sort of brings us to what we're going to talk about this week. We're going to be discussing the culture of paganism and witchcraft. Ken, I know you and I both have had several experiences throughout the years where we have encountered neo-pagans and those who practice the old ways, and as well as artifacts related to many of these traditions.
Yeah, one particular case comes to mind, and it's one that I actually consulted you on because it was fascinating. I had a suicide. The man he was elderly, very ill. He was a professional storyteller in the classical old world fashion. He would go to
Mm.
places dressed in robes and a staff, and he kind of looked wizardly. Long white beard, that whole thing. And I get to his house. He shot himself in the head. And in a little corner of his living room, there was an altar. And on that altar was an image, basically a statue, a little miniature statue of somebody that I didn't know who it was. And I think you helped pinpoint that it was Mercury. And he also had this flat green artifact. I'm not sure what material it was made of, stone probably, very intricately woven and stuff like that. And then, through research, I was able to determine that it was a representation of the Green Man. So Celtic folklore and that kind of thing, forest, green, that kind of thing. Putting all that together, it took a little while to try to figure out what was going on, especially when I read his 47-page suicide note that
Mm.
he had spent 15 years writing.
Wow.
He had attempted or contemplated suicide several times, but his suicide note was very, he talked about a lot of, well, not only a lot of politics and everything else, but he talked a lot about his paganism and his belief
Mhm.
systems and stuff like that. So it was that was fascinating. But I've had other cases, even more unusual case, which wasn't my case. Again, it was actually the same girl who had the Santeria case. She gets called out on the scene to a hanging. And this woman she committed suicide by hanging herself from a tree. And when she gets there, there's no artifacts, there's nothing like that. But when she gets to the scene, this woman's daughter, 20 something year old female, she walks out of the house completely naked, walks to the tree, and begins dancing around the tree and a ritual. And this may be something, Star may be able to help us, help me understand a little bit better. She began to dance around the tree in a mourning ceremony for her mom. And of course, law enforcement is all staring. Apparently, she was quite the fetching woman, but law enforcement was just staring, kind of befuddled, didn't know what to do. She's basically trampling all over the crime scene or the death scene, and but it was part of her culture. So these little things like that, we see it all the time in this particular job. Probably more paganism and more witchcraft than a lot of the Caribbean religions in Northeast Florida, anyway.
Another fascinating aspect we want to look at on this show is mourning rituals. How do we culturally mourn? And rituals where death is something we have to approach, depending on what tradition you may come from. How do you approach that? What does that look like? And when we talk about paganism and we talk about witchcraft, unfortunately, kind of like voodoo, throughout the years, Hollywood has definitely done a disservice to this particular spiritual culture. It's frequently, equated with some sort of malevolent sorcery. We've seen incidents through the years where a public safety agency may stumble upon a pagan ceremony or particular artifacts at a scene. And in many cases, it's with a certain amount of fear and trembling among those who are unfamiliar with the culture. When we look at witchcraft through the anthropological lens, it's the early pioneers of anthropology tended to focus on what was considered at the time exotic. Exotic was sort of a code word for non-Western. And today, when we use the term exotic, it's rather ethnocentric term. As when it comes to the reality is we all are somewhat exotic to a certain degree. Exotic is a relative term. What may seem abnormal to you may be very normal to me. So much of the early anthropological writings were really frequently used to describe what we know as sorcery, some sort of evil intent behind them. And witchcraft was frequently viewed as a social threat. And a lot of this has to do with the culture in which it is being defined. When I've spent time in Africa, anytime the word witchcraft was used, it was most frequently used to describe sorcery. In fact, there are still areas of sub-Saharan Africa where children and elderly are frequently accused of being witches and are targeted for abuse and violence because of these stereotypes. Now, it's interesting because indigenous healers typically will use a form of ritual protection as a way to keep away witchcraft that doesn't involve abuse or violence. But we see a lot of these contemporary groups, what Dr. Richard Hoskins once referred to as these Frankenstein churches that combine elements of Pentecostalism, a little bit of African folklore, and extremism. We see a very different thing here in the West when it comes to paganism.
Well, but here's the thing: when you're talking about the Frankenstein Church, and you're describing syncretism, which was a problem even here in the United States, especially in the early pioneer years. As well as I do that one of my passions. We've talked about this. One of my passions is Appalachian folklore. I'm originally from Kentucky. And so Appalachian folklore is a huge thing. Well, Appalachia was colonized by mostly Celtic people, Irish Celtic people. And they brought with them a lot of their customs and a lot of their, I guess, what you would consider to be pagan belief systems and customs that had also been integrated through syncretism with the church. And so it's interesting you talked about the fact that in Africa you have this a difference between witchcraft and sorcery, and that certain things are kind of allowed, certain things are not, because in Appalachia it's very much the same thing. I could tell you 100 different ways to keep a witch out of your home based on Appalachian folklore. One of my favorite, and I've got it on my door, is hanging a broom from the door. The witch isn't able to enter your house because she's a little OCD, and she's compelled to count every little frond from that broom. So Appalachian wanted to keep witches out. The whole idea is to keep from being witched, but at the same time, you've got these people that are known as granny women or granny witches, and these were the matriarchs of villages in Appalachia. But they were also, like Granny from Beverly Hillbillies, the doctors. They're the ones who were the
Absolutely.
herbalists. They delivered babies, but they also gave you love potions, and they gave you this that, and the other. You have other witches that were known as water witches, who were known to essentially divine where well water could be found, and
Yeah.
these were heralded by the villages in Appalachia as good things. So there is a distinct difference in culture between good witches and bad witches, and most of our world cultures.
It's interesting, the cultural differences of cultural perceptions between an indigenous healer and someone using witchcraft, depending on what that culture determines witchcraft to be. And we see, and we see this in a lot of Latin American cultures as well. It's interesting that you'll see in Mexico witchcraft referred to as brujeria. It's a social threat. It is something that can harm you. It is something that can haunt you. You'll see traditional healers, the curanderas, utilizing herbal remedies, utilizing different amulets and different rituals that utilize spiritual power, but they're utilized in a way to benefit society and to benefit the people in the communities. Here in the West, when we talk about paganism and witchcraft have a very different meaning than we see in some areas, such as Africa and areas of Mexico. The term pagan comes from a number of sources. Some researchers have traced the term back to the early 1300s, where the term was used to refer to a rural citizen. In fact, some Wiccan scholars say that this is also reflective in the term heathen, a word that was used to refer to people of the heath. These were people who lived in the country. They were country dwellers. They were traditional healers. They were midwives. And practices of many of the earth traditions were referred to as pagan, as they didn't follow the practices of the Abrahamic traditions. And so, it was a descriptive term in some historical context. Practitioners we typically see in paganism focus on being in harmony with nature and the sacredness of human life, which, goes against a lot of the early perceptions that paganism was meant to kill and hurt and
Human
you know
sacrifices.
yeah, exactly. Deities found among some of the pre-Christianized Europe communities are often honored as the goddess and gods of many world cultures are venerated. Practices involving the cycle of the seasons and the use of magic are held as sacred, and practitioners may be initiated into various traditions, such as forms of Wicca, or they may be, like our upcoming guest, practice outside of a specific traditional lineage. In anthropology, we're taught that in order to understand a culture, we must not only have an understanding from an outside perspective, but that we must also have an understanding into what the insider's perspective is about a culture. And this is what gives us a holistic view of culture. This is what we want to focus on in our show, this holistic view of culture. Before we bring on our guest, Ken, is there any last thing you'd like to add to that?
So far, I think it's been a fantastic conversation.
Okay, absolutely. We've got a lot of stories to tell. We've got a lot of information to share. And like you, we are here to learn. We will be back momentarily. Our first guest, Star Bustamonte, is an eclectic, non traditional witch who's the news editor for The Wild Hunt. Wild Hunt's an online pagan news source. She's also a co host of the blog talk radio show, The 415, with Raina Starr. Starr is a friend, a practitioner, and an authority on pagan religions. Starr, it is my pleasure to welcome you as our very first guest on Crime Scenes and Cultures.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be your very first guest.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us. We are talking about encounters with different spiritual traditions, particularly when it comes to medico legal investigators at scenes. So, in helping them understand what they may encounter at a scene involving pagan traditions, what exactly does that mean to be pagan?
First of all, let me just say that paganism is a very broad term, much in the sense that Christianity is a very broad term, and there are lots of different types of Christianity. For pagans, typically it involves earth-based belief systems and practices. So a reverence for the natural world and seeing all things within nature as being connected to the divine. So I would say that, you know, in the broadest of terms, most people who would identify as pagan have an affinity and a reverence for the natural world and see the divine reflected in that world.
So, when we talk about paganism, frequently the concept of witchcraft will come up in conversations about paganism. Where does witchcraft come in? And what does the term Wiccan also mean in relation to paganism?
Right. So witchcraft is definitely, it's not a religion per se. There are pagan practices that can be identified as witchcraft that may be part of a broader spiritual practice.
Mhm.
So, like Wicca under the pagan umbrella would be a type of paganism that incorporates witchcraft. A lot of times the two terms are used interchangeably, Wicca being a form of witchcraft, but Wicca itself is a recognized religion. And so I think a lot of people get tripped up on that and
Mhm.
wrongly think that all witches are Wiccans and everyone who practices witchcraft is is Wiccan, and that's incorrect. So
I
you
see.
can have somebody who practices some form of witchcraft, of which there are like a lot of different varieties of witchcraft that are practiced worldwide. Many that are drawing on roots that go way back as far as witchcraft practices go.
I guess in a sense would be like assuming Wicca and witchcraft of being the same in that particular vein would be like saying all Baptists are the same as Methodists or the same as
Right,
Catholics,
exactly. Yeah,
but all falling under the head of the Christian spiritual tradition.
right, right. So just like you have a variety of Christian beliefs, you have a variety of pagan, and then as a subheading or subcategory, you have a variety of witchcraft practices that are, you know, I mean, you can find virtually any culture, especially in the Western world, whether you're talking about Europe or the U.S., Canada, even Australia, there are witchcraft practices that are tied to distinct culture.
I see. So typically, when we talk about witchcraft and neo pagan cultures, there is a focus many times on the use of magic. What is magic and what role does it play in neo pagan religions?
One of the ways that I like to describe magic is that it's, if you think about the power, like electricity. So when you turn on when you have your house wired for electric use and you flip a switch, it turns on a light. And so if you think of magic in terms of it being a form of energy, then it becomes whether you're drawing as a practitioner, whether a practitioner is drawing that energy, on a divine level, or drawing energy from earth-based energies, the moon, the sun, celestial, however you want to define it, and there are lots of ways to define it, that is the essence of magic. And so from a magical practitioner standpoint, they are using the energy that is available to them to accomplish, whether it's reverence for a deity, ancestor veneration, or to complete a specific task. So using magic to, like, let's say if I'm going to I'm looking for a new job and I want to enhance the process and maybe open up more opportunities for myself, I might take a magical approach to that. In addition to, putting my resume out there, I would maybe do a simple ritual just asking for assistance from, some of the deities that I work with, possibly my ancestors, and just saying, hey, this is what I need. Help me to make this easier in finding what I'm looking for.
So, there are a lot of concepts you're describing that is really different than how Hollywood portrays witchcraft. We've seen through the years a lot of spiritual traditions depicted in Hollywood and through various forms of religious propaganda. What are some of the myths that you've encountered through the years in regards to pagan traditions?
Right. There are a lot of those out there. I think when the movie The Craft was released, it was really kind of pivotal in stimulating a lot of interest in witchcraft, and often not in a good way. But so like some of the things just within the movie The Craft was, the girls changed their hair color and their eye color. Okay. Most witches that are looking to change their hair color are going to, go buy a box of Clairol or go see a hairdresser. But perhaps the biggest mistake, or the way things are construed, is that there is some affinity for the Christian devil, and that pagans and witches worship the devil. Well, that's a Christian concept. Then within paganism, there's really not a devil per se. So there's no correlation there whatsoever. And that's just frankly wrong. The idea that pagans eat babies, or do, human sacrifice rituals, all of that. Those are all myths. And while there are definitely ancient pagan cultures that did do any number of types of sacrifice, whether it was animals or, in some cases there is documentation of course it was recorded by the conquerors. So, but there was sacrifice at certain points in history of humans, but within neo-paganism, that is not a thing, and yet it is continually brought up.
And those perceptions, unfortunately, affect the psyche of humanity. Those images sort of, one, they placed pagan practitioners in this oppositional corner, that is an enemy to mankind, through some of these movies and through some of these stereotypes. It also has affected, in some cases, how public safety agencies have interacted with practitioners. I know that, about 30 years ago, Star and I first met, and one of our first encounters was the result of a situation where a spiritual community was gathering on private property and was observing a seasonal festival, and very legal, very ethical, nothing going on. But yet a local neighbor had decided to call authorities and report that there was some sort of satanic rite going on, and he had spotted animals and children and knives and robes and all this sort, which, as this communication was sent on, sort of started building this hostile reaction for some that arrived at the scene. Have you seen other encounters like this over the years?
I have not had very many encounters like that, but I do know of other people who have had, that have had more extreme experiences with law enforcement being called to public gatherings. And so the impact of negative portrayals in the in the media and in TV series and movies, all of that can have an impact on how a first responder acts when they are called to a scene like that. In my case, I've been lucky, but and especially these days, I think the potential for overreaction or violence is certainly, I think, more prevalent than it has been in the past. So there's definitely a cause and effect in that. But I've had people that were, had guns drawn on them, as we did at the event that you described, that were how we first met. I mean, they came in, guns drawn, which is not a fun place to be.
What we need to move toward is an understanding of those outside the culture and those within the culture of the needs that are there. Let's pretend and say that a specific agency, whether it be a local sheriff's department, whether it be crime scene investigators, arrive at a scene. What sort of things could those outside of the pagan culture approaching for maybe even the first time, what sort of things would you suggest to them in making practitioners feel more at ease? And likewise, what can practitioners do to make those encountering them for the first time more at ease?
Well, I think general respect all the way around. From a practitioner point, recognizing that if first responders of whatever variety are arriving on a scene, they're not there just for the hell of it. They're there because they've either received a call or there's some kind of concern. So recognizing that they are just doing their job and not being, not obstructing them, but also being, what is it that Mr. Rogers said? Look for the helpers, right? Be a helper. Don't, being hostile is not going to get you anywhere. And if anything, it's going to put their backs up even more if they already were. So that's from a practitioner point of view. From a responder point of view, I mean, I think that you have to recognize that whether you believe as, whatever environment you're stepping into, they have a right to believe and practice whatever it is that they practice.
Mm-hmm.
And respecting that, treat it with the same level of respect and accord that you would if you were in a church, because essentially you are in a church. It just
Right.
doesn't look like the church that maybe you're used to, but it deserves the same level of respect.
Absolutely. And I know that through the years in working with different pagan communities, it's always been something that I try to communicate is, hey, if you have someone coming in, if you have first responders, whether they be an ambulance having to be called in to assist someone who's slipped and fell during a ritual, because I believe we both have seen that through the years.
More than once.
Yeah. And, or, someone responding to a call, understanding the perception that maybe there's something in our sacred space that can appear threatening, specific any sort of blades that may be there, not for the purpose to cut, not for the purpose of some sort of weapon to hurt someone, but for the purpose of spiritual activities. And understanding that maybe someone who's seeing an altar for the first time doesn't understand what that blade is there for. And their focus is, hey, I want to go home at the end of the night. So I need to know that's not going to be something that's going to be a threat. So when we get in these situations like this, what do you think, for example, let's say a medical legal investigator arrived at the scene at maybe a sudden or unexplained death. There are pagan-based sacred spaces at the scene. Would you explain to our listeners what these might look like?
Right. So there are a lot of different ways that sacred space could appear. First and foremost, there's usually going to be some kind of boundary if it's a circle. So at the four quarters, which would be representing the four directions of the compass, and then the elements that are associated with them. So
Mm-hmm.
east is air, south is fire, west is water, and north is earth. So, like for instance, let's say that they were coming in on the eastern side of the space, and that would be your boundary marker for air and the east. So there might be wind chimes hanging or things that might blow in the wind. There might also be incense that would be, wafting around. Sometimes if it's a space that's regularly used for ritual work, then it would have permanent, boundaries set up almost assuredly. If it is a temporary space, like let's say that they're in a public park and they were doing honoring one of the high days, like okay, so we're coming up on Samhain, which most people would recognize from a secular standpoint as Halloween, Samhain being an ancestral holiday. But let's say that we have a group of people in a park and they're going to do some type of ancestral ritual for Samhain. So if they were going to cast a physical circle, they're going to use something to delineate that space, maybe. So you might see cornmeal on the ground. A lot of times salt is used, but because salt can be harmful to the environment and to the ground, if they're going to cast where they want a physical hard boundary, they might use cornmeal or blue cornmeal. So you could see that on the ground. There would most likely be some type of altar in the center of the space. So, this could be anything from, a lot of times, especially for temporary, when working in temporary space, like a TV tray, like one of the nice, wooden TV trays that folds up, or a folding table might be used, or they could even be using a picnic table if that's what's there. Um, Pagans are very good at using whatever is at hand to do what they need to. On the altar,
Mm-hmm.
you might have some depictions of deities. If it was an ancestor oriented ritual, then you could expect to see pictures of people's deceased family members that would be placed, to be honored. Candles for sure, incense. There could be an athame or blade. Typically, swords you don't see so much on altars, but they are often used a lot of times to declare sacred space. Chalice, a cauldron, crystals. There are a lot of things that could be on an altar.
Like a lot of spiritual traditions I've seen through the years, some of these artifacts that are used in spiritual work can vary from being mass manufactured objects to homemade objects to natural
Mm-hmm.
objects.
Sure. Sure, absolutely. I mean, not uncommon to see, animal parts as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times, like deer hooves are used to make rattles, deer antlers used a lot of times as the hilt of a blade. You might have, depending on what type of practice it is, it's entirely possible that they could have, even animal skulls as part of the altar. When we think of ancestor veneration. Most people tend to think of in terms of people, but there's also, remembering our animal friends that have passed as well. So it might not be, unusual to have, an urn with ashes of a past pet, a pet that passed during that cycle. So
Mm.
lots of different things you might find on an altar. My experience has been, that most pagans are going to be willing to talk to you about, like, if you approach them respectfully and say, okay, I need to know what this is, or can you explain what this is? They're going to be willing to, to walk you through and say, well, okay, so this is this aspect, this is that aspect. Obviously, if there's been a death, they may be a little squirrely in general, and possibly nervous, but I think most people would be willing to explain what they're doing, why they're doing, and why they have the things that they have for what they're doing.
So when a practitioner, say, is at a scene and a crime scene investigator is there and they're doing like a walkthrough of the scene, how would you suggest that someone outside of the community coming into someone's home or sacred space, how should they treat artifacts that they may encounter?
With the same level of regard that they would treat, the chalice in a Catholic church, or any other religious house of worship. Whether they believe in, whatever it is that's being practiced is irrelevant. Obviously, the people practicing do. And so you wouldn't go barreling into a church and treat the items on an altar in a church with disrespect. So if that's your method of operating, then those same things apply when it comes to any kind of pagan space. If you
Hmm.
wouldn't do it in a
Great.
church, don't do it in a ritual circle.
Right. Great advice. Great advice. Let me ask you something. When we look at, for instance, when we look at a victim that, or someone who is passed of a natural death, and there is a examination of the body, are there any particular scars, maybe tattoos, or even ritual body paint that might give some insight into possible affiliation with a particular pagan spiritual tradition?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's like oodles and gobs, but okay, so like a triple moon, which is a crescent moon on each side, and then the full, a full sphere in the center. That's a
Hmm.
representation of the three aspects of the goddess. So anybody that would have like that type of tattoo probably has some, is involved in some form of goddess worship or practice. There are so many symbols. Obviously a pentagram, which is a five-pointed star, or a pentacle, is certainly associated with paganism and witchcraft. So someone that would have one of those somewhere on their body would, it's a pretty good bet that they're pagan of some flavor. As far as like Norse practices, like a Thor's hammer. It has another name too, but I always mispronounce it. Not being a heathen myself, there are, I mean, golly, there are a lot of. I mean, I would say those are probably some of the bigger ones as far as the most common.
And I understand and appreciate that representations are so vast. We talk about paganism being this huge spiritual frontier with many different traditions. So there's literally hundreds of symbols for each tradition that might show up. Can you talk a little bit to the use of ritual body paint?
Right. So, and I think this is somewhat true for tattoos, and some people will also do like ritually done tattoos, as
Hmm.
well as their scarification and also branding.
Mm-hmm.
Body paint would be kind of both a way of exploring that, but also,
Mm-hmm.
so if you think in terms of in other religious practices, if you're going to pray, you're seeking to be in a certain headspace or
Mm-hmm.
even altered state.
Mm-hmm.
The application of and use of body paint can help to kind of promote stepping into an altered state of mind, or being more in attunement with whatever energies that a practitioner would be working with.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, once again, I mean, this is really broad, but so yes, you could see the use of all of the symbols, any or all of the symbols that I mentioned a few minutes ago, but also, like, let's say that there was a focus on transformation. If this ritual that was happening was working towards some kind of shift or transformation, you might see snakes as having been applied as as an image, because snake is transformation, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
butterflies, moths. Once again, those, because how does a butterfly or moth get to be a butterfly or moth? Well, it starts out as a caterpillar, right? And so it's a
Correct.
sign of metamorphosis and shift and change. The
Mm.
reason the snake is used so much is because what do? They shed their skin. So a lot of symbology in that, or symbolism. But and I think when you're talking about any kind of symbols being used, that a lot of it is deeply personal too. So
Sure.
what to you or me may be like, well, that's a cat. Well, to somebody who works with the Egyptian goddess Bast, it's not just a cat, it's a representation of a deity, or just like people who talk about dream interpretation, right? To me, it's just a spool of thread, but if you had it may have a deeper meaning for you, depending on what your history is and what you associate with that symbol. And I think that's
Sure.
true with a lot of what you see in body art.
I liken it to an artist painting a picture,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone comes into the gallery and they go, "Oh, he must be expressing his feelings toward fill in the blanks." And that artist sits back and knows what their intent was. They know what the symbol they painted, what that stood for. And there's, as you were saying, there seems to be many times we interpret symbols based on our experience, based on where we may be coming from, or what we've heard in the past. So definitely, I think that's tremendous advice there in interpreting different aspects. That it is in the eye of the
Oh,
beholder.
absolutely. Well, and two, I think it's easy to misinterpret just about anything at first glance. One of the advantages, I think, for those who work in forensics and any type of investigator is, first of all, most of them tend to be pretty good at what they do, and they are trained observers. So, and especially if they have someone that is standing right there that they can say, hey, do you know what this is? Or do you know why this would be? Or, anything along those lines. I mean, I would encourage investigators to tap into what's available to them. And even if they're not comfortable, I mean, if you're talking about a violent crime and that has ritual components to it, then that's a little bit different, and you probably can't really trust. You may not be able to trust what you're getting from people in attendance, but there are people like me who are more than willing to be of assistance and offer. Well, I know what that is because it's this, and it's a ritual thing. So I think that's important, and for practitioners, of just being open and honest with investigators, and not hindering them, because I think it's unfortunate that because of the level of misunderstanding sometimes, that people are uncomfortable and they're afraid that they're going to be
Sure.
accused of some type of wrongdoing, so they're reluctant to be really honest about what they know or what they believe to be true or what might have happened.
Our past experiences, our level of bias, whatever that may be, definitely affect how we interact with each other. And I think that's you and I both through the years when we've taught together and consulted on cases together. We want to bring the actuality of the culture to those trying to understand what the culture is. It sometimes is hard when you're in a position where someone asks you about something that may be very sacred to you, and you may react with, I don't want to talk to you about that. A lot of occasions that leaves this space for suspicion, for wondering. It's kind of like through the years where, we hear in many different spiritual traditions the use of secrets. And one thing I have to try to communicate to those who may be encountering a culture for the first time, secrets aren't necessarily bad things. In fact, most of the time they're simply there to protect a tradition and to be given to those who at a particular initiatory phase have received the understanding of different concepts. So when the word secrets are thrown out, many times as humans, we tend to think the worst. And so there's got to be this middle ground of, hey, maybe you can't tell me what a particular word or symbol is during a specific degree because it's just for within the culture. But maybe you can explain to me, hey, this is a secret. It's not a secret that denotes criminal activity, denotes any kind of abuse or violence. It's just simply a religious kept secret. But that way, that information at least is put on the table to assist in understanding.
Yeah, I agree. But I also think that, I'm all about, respecting people's privacy and their practices. But I'm here to tell you that if it's going to make the difference between me being a suspect and being able to walk away from a situation without having that hanging over my head, I'm going to tell you everything I know.
But now listen, before we leave this, I've got to ask you, were you the one that shared with me the story years ago? And when we talked about ritual body paint, this reminded me that was driving home one evening and got pulled over.
Yes.
Can you please tell that story?
Right.
It's a great story.
And I'll also answer Kent's question too.
Okay.
Yeah, so we had been at this was not too long after you and I had first met. And I had been at, it was either, I think it was either a Mabon. No, it was a full moon ceremony, but it was in between Mabon, which is the autumnal equinox, and Samhain, which is secular Halloween. And we had actually used some face paint that was made from wine and actual goat's blood. We mixed a tiny bit of blood in with the wine, and then red clay that had come actually from Scotland. And I had worn a ceremonial blade, which was a dirk, which is a Scottish. It's much shorter than an actual sword, but it's quite long. I mean, in terms of a knife, so probably the blade on it is roughly, I don't know, 12 inches or so.
Mm-hmm.
And when we had left, like I don't know, I just forgot to take it off, so it was hanging. So it was hanging down, off of my hip as I'm sitting in the car, which I hadn't really thought about it. I was probably maybe 3 blocks from home, and I got pulled over by a police officer because I had a tail light out, which I did not realize. And only after I got pulled over did I think, oh shit, I am wearing a weapon. This is not good. And so but I'm like totally not thinking about the fact that I also have, you know, stuff painted on my face. And I mean, it wasn't a lot, but it was there. And so the cop's like looking at me and he's like, so, did you know you have a tail light out? And I'm like, oh golly, no, I do not. I did not know. And I will get that taken care of, first thing tomorrow. And he's like, so where you been? I'm like, have you been to a party? And I'm like, um, he's like, you were at a thing, weren't you? And I'm like, yes, yes, I was at a thing. That's exactly it. and basically, I'm like, we got to a point in our exchange where I was like, yes, I've been at a spiritual celebration. And because I had given him my driver's license, I think he might have even been the one that brought it up and said, I told him that, I was a little nervous because we'd had some trouble out in Hickman County. And he's like, oh yes, I heard about that. He's like, but it ended very well. And we had a kind of a chuckle about it. But, so even the most benign possible situation, I mean, had he been less open and more aggressive, I mean, things could have been, unpleasant for me.
Sure. And, I love that story because it's like, you know what? He couldn't really put into words what he thought you may have been doing.
Right.
He just knew you were at a thing and you could both agree on, yes, I was at a thing.
Well, and
and
I don't think I didn't have to get out of the vehicle. So, I mean, like, I did not mention the fact that, I am wearing a really long, sharp, pointy thing either.
well, sometimes all we can agree on is, hey, we both acknowledge that you're doing something, I'm doing something, and we're both doing what we're
Yeah.
doing.
Well, exactly. And as my dear sweet husband would say, you're never too busy to say please and thank you. And you know, I think that that's always a good approach, no matter who you're dealing with.
That's
Is to
right.
be courteous, and I mean, and obviously, being white, I definitely have an advantage. There is the elements of racism that are present within our society are, for me, it's not an issue, but it certainly is for others. And I think that's also something to be mindful of. If people are cautious, especially from a, first responder point of view, if people are being cagey and are uncomfortable, there's probably, there may be other reasons than that there's any kind of wrongdoing.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
and so earlier, Kent had mentioned that there was a situation where a woman had, I think, committed suicide, and while officers were on site and first responders, that she exited the house completely naked and then went and did some kind of dance around the tree where her mother had committed suicide. And he was wondering if I had any insight into that. There is absolutely no telling what that might have been from a practitioner standpoint. I would have, that could have been handled so much better from her perspective if that was something that she felt she needed to do, like in that moment. She could have easily interacted with the officers. Well, I say easily. I don't know what her situation was, but if it was me, I would have gone to the responders and said, "Hey, there's this thing I need to do, and before you remove my mother's body, I would like to have access to perform this ritual." And maybe y'all should turn your backs.
It's a thing where we all grieve differently. We practice. Everyone has their way they express themselves spiritually, and our goal in all of this is to bring an understanding together,
Yeah, absolutely.
and that's our hope with this show. And Star, I just want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing with our listeners. Where can they find you?
Well, they can find my writing at The Wild Hunt, which is wildhunt.org. Don't go to wildhunt.com. That will take you to a gaming site. That is not us. um, the first Thursday of every month, Raina and I do our show at 4 o'clock. It's called the 4:15, and you can find us on Blog Talk Radio. And you can always find me on Twitter, and my handle is at Divine Disturber.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. And that's going to do it for our first episode of Crime Scenes and Cultures, where we try to demystify the mysterious. From Kent and I, we bid you farewell till next time.